Spider-Man was missing, and after he pushed Indy off of a building, the crime rates have been going up. Spider-Man was defeated and gave up on power and responsibility. Peter was at the hospital every day checking if Indy was going to make it okay. Peter was slipping through his classes and he became more depressed, blaming himself for what happened. Peter picked Indy's hand up, whispering in her ear that he was sorry for everything that happened and he wished that he could have done more by saving her. A TV broadcast interrupted the news station and the anchorman said that last week a warehouse exploded, killing the Gain twins, those two psycho criminals. The trail the FBI discovered is that Spider-Man was involved and rigged the warehouse to blow up, killing the twins inside. The warehouse was bought by a tech company run by Quentin Beck. Reconstruction of the building will begin tomorrow. Peter grabbed the remote, shutting the TV off in anger, and the door opened and Mary Jane and Harry Osborn walked into the hospital room and brought Peter a coffee. They sat down and asked if Peter was okay, and he didn't know what to tell them. He wanted to tell them the truth, but how could he? Everybody hated Spider-Man for what he did, and now Peter Parker had to find himself again. A doctor came out of the room and demanded for Peter Parker to come outside. He was confused and his spider sense went off, but Peter agreed and he walked out of the room. The doctor told Peter that there was a May on the phone and that she needed to talk to Peter. He picked up the phone and he could hear crying in the background. Peter was confused and he asked what was wrong, and it was Aunt May. She told Peter not to worry, but she was going to need to see him tonight. Peter asked Aunt May what was wrong, but she didn't want to tell Peter, and he told her he was coming soon, hanging up the phone. He started rushing out of the hospital, but Harry yelled Peter's name as he was about to leave. He said for him to wait up and told Peter that Indy had awoken from the coma, and he went with Harry into the room, seeing her talk to Mary Jane. Peter asked how she was doing, and Indy said she felt better, but her memories were all screwed up. Everything was everywhere. She could see Spider-Man hugging her and then crying, and then sirens and darkness. Peter grabbed her hand, kissing her, and he felt a sense of relief knowing that things were going to be okay. The doctors walked into the room asking Peter to leave with his friends, and Peter told Indy that he was going to phone her once she felt better. Peter, Harry, and Mary Jane walked outside of the hospital, and Peter told them that he might not be seen at ESU for a while. And Harry asked Peter what about his grades? Was he really going to be skipping classes? And Peter laughed, saying that he was going to have to catch up soon, but he said Aunt May wants to talk to him about something. Peter said, I'm worried about her, and Peter looked at his watch, seeing how late it was, and he ran into an alleyway, jumping on top of a building rooftop. Missing the feeling of being Spider-Man, Peter ran to Queens, jumping from building to building like what he did when he first got his powers. He jumped off of a ledge, seeing Aunt May's house, and there was cop cars parked outside of the driveway, and a flash of white went into Peter's head. He remembered what the cops said. Bad news, son. Your uncle's been shot dead, murdered. Peter kept walking towards the house, feeling disoriented, and he heard a voice in his head, stop that guy, he has my money. Peter then heard a scream in his head. As he was lifting up the robber, he didn't stop when his Uncle Ben was shot. He walked into the house and the memories just kept flashing within his head. An officer asked Peter to sit down as Peter walked into the room, and there was Officer Barr talking to Aunt May with papers in her hands and mugshots of criminals. The officer said it's a long story, but you should sit down and hear us out on this one. We've reopened the Ben Parker case because we believe we found the real killer that night. It felt like Peter had been punched or hit with a car in the gut, and Officer Barr grabbed a mugshot of the convicted killer, Dennis Carradine, and told Peter that this man was still alive and that he had escaped prison. He told a cellmate that the real killer had still been on the loose and that he was only taking the blame to cover for one of the Kingpin's guys. Officer Barr told Peter that the real killer was Flint Marko and that they had trailed Marko, but he soon had vanished. They believed that he might be helping Kingpin make a deal with the new building owner, Quentin Beck, at the waterfront docks. It's some kind of technology sale happening at the docks around 2 a.m., and they told Peter and Aunt May that they would catch Flint Marko, and if it's true, he will be thrown in prison with Dennis Carradine. Officer Barr gave Peter a mugshot of Flint Marko, and Peter slammed it on the ground with tears in his eyes as the table slowly cracked. Barr put his hand on Peter, but Peter's spider sense went off, and Peter grabbed his arm, telling Officer Barr to get out of here and to do his job properly this time. Aunt May yelled at Peter, and Peter sat down with Aunt May. She started crying, and Peter hugged her. He told her that Uncle Ben's killer would be found tonight, and Aunt May told Peter that she wished none of this ever happened. Peter had flashes of him throwing Indy off of the building, and he knew that if he would have stopped the robber, he could have been able to prevent Uncle Ben's death, and all of the pain Spider-Man had caused was still causing the people he cared about pain. He wasn't Spider-Man anymore, and Peter didn't understand how this was happening to him. The actions of Peter Parker were still haunting him to this day, and Peter told Aunt May he was going to stay the night with her. Peter picked up the remote and turned the TV on. Aunt May went to make coffee, asking Peter how things were outside of all of this, and he explained that he heard someone close to him that he didn't know what to do. Peter had tears in his eyes, and Peter admitted to Aunt May that it's been hard without Uncle Ben and that things might have been different if he was still around. Aunt May said, whatever happens tonight, we're going to have to accept the fact that we can't bring him back. Ben would want us to move on. Ben wouldn't want us to start living in sadness, but living in happiness. Peter knew that Aunt May was right and that he couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. The TV played an interview and Peter couldn't even believe what he was seeing. Indy was being interviewed on TV and the interviewer was talking to this man, Matt Murdock. Indy said Spider-Man needs to be held accountable for his actions and that she wants to sue him for what he did to her. Matt Murdock explained to the press what damage Spider-Man has caused her, and she wanted to have something in return. She wanted him unmasked and a public apology after the court case. Peter thought to himself that he couldn't win. Spider-Man couldn't win and Peter Parker couldn't win either. The two were one and one was going to suffer just like the other one. Peter needed to end this tonight where it all began, when Flint Marko pulled the trigger. Aunt May was asleep and the clock was starting to tick faster and faster. Peter had flashes of Indy getting thrown off of a building and flashes of him letting Uncle Ben's killer go. He had flashes of him doing good things for other people when he stopped the hostages and saved Indy, and when he got his amazing powers when he was bit by the spider. He couldn't change the past, but Peter knew that he could become a hero once again and change the future. He could stop the court case and he could stop Uncle Ben's killer. Peter jumped out of the window and he grabbed his extra web shooters from Aunt May's house. He went swinging into the city fast, listening to the words of Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Peter needed to do what was right. He made it to the old docks looking around. His costume was there somewhere, but where was it? Peter jumped into the water and he saw something floating in the water. He heard cars parking in the driveway and he started to hear talking. Peter went further out and he saw a briefcase floating in the distance, but he put bricks in it, so how was it possible that it was floating in the water? He was confused, but Peter unlocked it and there was his costume, but something was wrong. There was goo on the costume. He grabbed it, throwing it away, and Peter put his costume on, crawling around the docks. Kingpin walked out of an SUV with the device. Peter knew that the cops were coming and that he didn't need to do this, but it was his responsibility to do it. Quentin Beck took the device and handed a bag of money to the Kingpin. Spider-Man crawled up a lamppost and out walked Flint Marko and Dennis Carradine. Peter screamed as he saw them walk out of the car. Spider-Man swung in, kicking them to the ground. Quentin Beck ran for cover, getting the device, and Spider-Man was hit with a bolt of lightning from Kingpin's cane. He fell to the ground knocked out, and Kingpin laughed, saying that he liked his new look, but that wasn't going to cover his identity anytime soon. Spider-Man slowly got back up, seeing that his hands were covered in black, and he had a rush of anger. He yelled for the Kingpin to get out of his way, and he punched the Kingpin so hard that he went flying into a car, smashing his back into it. Dennis Carradine ran fast, but it wasn't fast enough. Spider-Man pushed him to the ground, and he picked up Dennis Carradine, smashing his back off of the pavement. Spider-Man froze as he saw Flint Marko. Flint Marko froze in shock, but Spider-Man was walking towards him like nothing was going to stand in his way. Flint ran to the dock, seeing that the waves were picking up, and he pleaded with Spider-Man. He yelled, saying that he couldn't swim, but Spider-Man said that he had other plans for him. He yelled, saying that this was for Ben Parker, and he wrapped a web around Flint Marko's neck, choking him to death. He was losing oxygen fast, and Spider-Man looked at his hands. He didn't know what he was doing. He let go, and Flint went into the water begging for help. He started drowning, and Flint Marko was dying and coughing. Peter had a flash in his head, and Uncle Ben explained that it wasn't about the choices, but it was about responsibility. Spider-Man used his webs and grabbed Flint Marko, and he pulled him up. The cops showed up, and Spider-Man's spider sense went off. They tried to shoot him, but Spider-Man front flipped over the cop car, swinging away. Spider-Man felt a rush of power within himself, and he went flying near a building, just catching himself, but he went meters forward. Spider-Man looked at his hands and feet, and Peter took his mask off. The powers weren't normal. He felt better, and he didn't know why. He couldn't place it. He put Aunt May at peace, and she could rest easy now, knowing that Uncle Ben's killer will be in jail for life now. Spider-Man crawled up the building, looking in the distance, seeing the cops throw Marko in the back of the seat. A voice was heard on the rooftop in the distance, and Spider-Man put his mask back on, but he was kicked in the head. He fell fast and far, but landed on his 2 feet, cracking the ground. Spider-Man looked up above to see someone. They almost kicked him in the face face, but he just missed his foot. Spider-Man used his webs, attaching it to the wall, and he slammed the figure to the ground. Spider-Man asked who he was, and the guy broke the webs, doing a backflip off of the wall and punched Spider-Man in the face. He called himself Daredevil. Daredevil explained that he was supposed to be the one to stop the Kingpin, and with that device in the wrong hands, it could potentially cause harm to the world. Spider-Man kicked him in the face, and Daredevil went flying into a wall. He tried to get back up, and Spider-Man used his webs on Daredevil's wrists. Daredevil had asked Spider-Man if he was going to be put in a coma like what he did to Indy. Spider-Man used his webs, but the suit turned into a whip, grabbing Daredevil by the chest. He picked up Daredevil off the ground. Spider-Man said, "Don't you ever mention that again to us," and he became confused. He said us, and he saw what he was doing, and he didn't know what was going on. He threw Daredevil away, and he smashed his face off of a wall. He fell to the ground as Spider-Man jumped off of a building, and he didn't know what was going on, but he felt a lot of power. Spider-Man thought to himself, he's gone for a week, and more costume clowns are trying to replace him. He couldn't believe it, and Spider-Man, as he was swinging in the city, he could see a robbery taking place. A man yelled for help on the street as Peter saw this, and he swung in. The man said, "Stop that guy," and two robbers got into a getaway car driving off. Spider-Man swung in, kicking the windshield, and the driver lost control of the car and was about to smash into a building. Music was getting louder and louder, and there was a party going on. Spider-Man told the driver to stop, and Spider-Man dug his hands into the car, trying to destroy the engine. The suit used its powers and disabled the engine, and the car flipped over, and Spider-Man backflipped, catching the pavement with his legs, and the car was in midair, and Spider-Man used all of his strength to catch the vehicle. One of the robbers broke the glass, and he got out of the vehicle. He ran, going into a crowd of people in the party. There was a huge party happening, and the robbers shot bullets, and screams were heard. Spider-Man could see Mary Jane and Harry partying with other kids from ESU. The robber pointed his gun at Spider-Man, telling him to get away from him, and everyone was screaming as they saw this monster walking faster and faster towards the robber. Spider-Man was getting bigger and bigger, and he walked up to the guy, choking him to death. He let go, and the guy fell to the ground. Peter screamed in pain, jumping off of the building, and he crawled up a wall screaming. His costume was consuming him. Peter started ripping it off of him as flashes of him pushing Indy off of the building kept going into his head, with him almost killing Flint Marko and that other costume character. He screamed as the costume was ripped away from him, and Peter ran, seeing that it was alive. He swung away until an alarm clock went off.